Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I hope you're all enjoying the World Science Festival and University as much as I am. I'm going to take you on a journey today, a sort of journey of discovery that my colleagues and I have been engaged with largely over the past 6 years, which is resulting in some fairly dramatic sort of changes in our understanding of both the quantity of fossils that are available in the search for human origins, as well as the quality, and leading to some new surprises. At the end of the lecture, I'm also going to give you some private insight into some of the newest discoveries that are about to come out that the world doesn't know about yet. And hopefully you'll see why we think it's a very bright future for the search for human origins. However, I want to caution something before I get into this story. Parts of this story are going to sound like eureka moments or lucky moments. They aren't. They often have a deep background to the discovery that was the engagement of many, many years, if not decades, of individuals' hard work and perseverance to find. So it's important to note that even though sometimes I might tell the story as if it's in a moment, please be aware that behind that are these great depths of scientific endeavor, and particularly exploration endeavor. My colleagues and I have been privileged to be engaged in the Cradle of Humankind just outside of Johannesburg. This is an area that has been known since the 1930s for its early fossil hominids. It was part of the searches by Raymond Dart, and then later by the great Robert Broom, that would lead to the discovery of many, many extraordinary fossils, but largely from just a tiny number of cave sites in a dolomitic limestone area. Sterkfontein, Swartkrans, Kromdraai, for anyone who's familiar with those sites, were the dominant sites that resulted in a recovery of something like about a third of the evidence of early hominid fossils on the continent of Africa. Now, that requires me to tell you a little bit of sort of factoids behind this field. One of the fascinating things about paleoanthropology is that it is a field of science that's often described as one of the hardest, because we seem to be seeking some of the rarest sought after objects on the planet, and it ends up as a science that remarkably, perhaps at times, has had more scientists than it does fossils that it studies. That often gives it an aberrancy. It can often lead to sort of personality traits where people work very hard to either protect the fossils that they've discovered for the teams and the effort that have been put in, or clubbishness can actually occur within our field. And we're trying to sort of alter those situations. I came to Africa in 1989, first to Kenya, then moving to South Africa, because I wanted to find fossils. And I first made my first major discovery at a site called Gladysville in 1991. That site, I recovered 2 fossil hominid teeth from the site. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot to you. But in a field of scraps, that discovery actually made National Geographic magazine, because it was the first new early hominid site that had been discovered in 48 years in southern Africa. That led me to the idea that there was more out there to be found. I threw myself into Gladysville, a very traditional site, and I began playing those lottery odds. Lottery odds in paleoanthropology are horrific, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more insight into the minds of people like me who do this subject. In East Africa, my colleague Don Johansson tells me that there is something like a 1 in 10 million chance of finding an early hominid fossil if you know that they're already on the landscape. Generally, what that translates to is about 1 in every 10 million of the fossils they find in East Africa is an antelope fossil or some other animal fossil, to the rare fragments, which are almost always teeth. About 80% of the record up until recently has been isolated teeth, if you can imagine that, because they preserve better. In southern Africa, we have remarkably better odds of finding hominid fossils. It's about 1 in 250,000 antelope fossils, largely, to actually discover an early hominid. But we have an additional problem. Instead of them just being on the landscape or eroding out of soft sediments, ours are generally encased in solid concrete-like rock called breccia. So that while we find them in a higher percentage in these cave sites, it can take 20,000 person hours just to recover one of the fossils from that hard rock. So we have to pay it back in time as opposed to the statistical odds, which sort of evens things out. I spent my career in southern Africa after the discovery of Gladysville, searching for additional sites, running the Gladysville operation. I eventually made quite a few small discoveries, but really nothing more than scraps. That was pretty good for paleoanthropology. We're a science of scraps, and even small contributions, even maybe over a dozen small fragments of hominids would have put me probably in the top 2 or 3 percentile of fossil finding discoverers that were alive at that particular time. I also won a great grant from National Geographic in 1997, their gold medal for exploration, and I used the money there to apply new technologies which had just emerged. Handheld GPS was just available at that time to actually map sites for the first time using satellite technology, and also using available satellite digital maps from NASA. You cannot believe how revolutionary this was, as I tried to merge these two technologies to find new sites that might have these early hominids in them. Those maps cost about $10,000 a sheet, and that sheet was covering an area about a 1 in 50,000 map size. We had to have these enormous computers to run them. I had to buy special computers, which were the largest in the university. I think they had to run something like 80 megabytes of data at once to actually process one of these maps, and they cost a fortune at that particular time. But out I went mapping these things. I didn't find that many new fossil hominid sites. In fact, I found none during that process, but I did find 4 new sites in this Cradle of Humankind area just outside of Johannesburg, which I thought was pretty good, because it being perhaps the most explored area on planet Earth for these fossils, there had only been over the years about 14 fossil-bearing deposits found and about 100 cave sites found in the region. So finding 4 new sites with this technology and good old-fashioned groundwork was pretty good, particularly in an area that people had been over. By the time we moved into the 21st century, though, those sites that I had discovered, I'd gone into, and we didn't find a whole lot out of those. The world had begun to change. Firstly, paleoanthropology went through some of its darkest days. There were the idea that our field was a field of depleting resources. There were papers published, if you can imagine, in 2000 by the leading scientists in the field saying there were no new fossil discoveries to be made, that we had the general pattern of hominid origins worked out. There would be no new fossil fields found on the continent of Africa, and we should quit training young paleoanthropologists. In fact, it was a declining resource. Can you believe that in a field as recently as 2000? By 2005, that kind of attitude had swelled into our organizations, and I'd built a organization on exploration, but hadn't found those big finds. And in our fields, big finds are about getting on into Nature and Science and journals like that. For many fields of science, those were the criteria and perhaps are the criteria of success, and the bits and pieces we were finding didn't do that. What was getting into those journals, though, were things like the virtual and digital analysis that was emerging. That was the age of the PC as we got sort of 2005, 2006. That was the age of the development of morphometric geometrics and these things. And so the analysis of existing fossils looked like the future, and my university began to move in that direction. I found myself, interestingly, chairing a job search to replace myself. That's a great feeling, by the way, if you're ever doing that. And eventually found a replacement. Our committee found a replacement, a young man named Charles Lockwood, who was going to introduce these new digital technologies, because we did hold something like 1/3 of the fossil assemblages for the fossil record held in Africa, and begin to move us in that direction. So by 2007, we had an idea, a plan in place. We'd begun to hire people. We're bringing people in. Our new director had not arrived yet, and I found myself soul searching and at a loss for what to do. And so, like many people of that era so long ago, I began surfing the web for inspiration for what would be my next thing if you couldn't get funding, and you really couldn't, for exploration activities. And that was at that moment in December of 2007, and I'll never forget that moment when I was staring at the computer and became the absolute last human being alive on planet Earth to discover Google Earth. And so I did what everyone else, all of you did when you first discovered Google Earth. What did you do? You look for your house, right? See if you're lying naked by the swimming pool. You can't say that to New Yorkers, I guess, but that also doesn't go down well in Europe. You can do that in South Africa, and I wasn't. You then start putting in places that are familiar to it. Eventually, you find that little white box where you've got those, where you can put GPS coordinates, and you shoot up into space and come down right on top of where you intended. And I had some of the most expensively obtained GPS coordinates in the world. And so I put the first one in. It was actually for the site of Glassville, shoots into the sky and lands on nothing. Second GPS coordinate, nothing. Third, nothing. Fourth, nothing. They were all wrong. It didn't take me long to Google why. The US government had owned those satellites back when I was doing that handheld GPS survey, and they put deliberate error into them. That combined with the poor resolution of the handheld GPSs at that time, it created a form of a compounding error. I'd wasted 3 years of my life mapping. I was not looking forward to making the call to National Geographic about that grant either. But so what I did was I started correcting those numbers. And as I did, I began to realize that patterns were in the position of caves, because I could see the cave sites and fossil sites that I'd intended to map. The resolution was magnificent out in the air, something like 5 meters. And I began to see that the fossil sites and cave sites seemed to be laid out in patterns. And then I began to see that the fossil sites themselves seemed to be clustering together around some sort of phenomena. If that error had not been made, I would have never seen that pattern. It was the process of that correcting. And in the process of doing that, I learned what a cave site and a fossil site looked from space. And it made me realize that well, that's one, this looks like one, even though I knew it was impossible, because everyone and their brother have for the last 80 years walked over this region. I myself, it's been 3 years doing it. But it bothered me enough so that in March, I actually loaded my dog into the car, a laptop, a 3G card, jumped in, went out into this area, went as far away from Gladysville as I could get, because I knew that area better than anyone, right into the city limits of a little town called Krugersdorp, where the Dolomites peter out, and on the first day found 21 new cave sites that no scientist had ever mapped. That got me addicted. I was hooked. So I started making targets and going out. 1 day at first, then 2 days, then sometimes 3 days a week. They were wondering what had happened to me in the office. They weren't really missing me very much because they were replacing me. And by July of that year, I had found 600 new cave sites in the most explored area on planet Earth, including over 70 fossil deposits. Remember, I told you we had, prior to that, only 18, including the 4 that I had discovered. 70, if you can imagine that. I was blown away. I thought that this was going to be my life's contribution. I mean, the additive value of all these potential fossil sites was great. By that time, I'd moved back into the area around Gladysville. And of course, what was happening to me elsewhere happened to me in a place that I knew the best, my own backyard, where I'd spent 17 years. I started finding cave sites, and I started finding fossil sites. On August the 1st, I walked up next to this lightning-struck tree and found a small pit in the ground. And there, right next to a road that I'd driven on maybe 250 times in the last 17 years, I found a little fossil site 1 kilometer away from Gladysville. Astounded me. But I was on a mapping expedition. I moved up into the valley behind here, and on that same day found more than 40 cave sites that no scientist had found, right in a valley right next to where I'd been working. What I didn't tell you was that we had a tragedy. A week before that happened, the young man who was going to take over this position as director and lead us into this new area was killed in a motorcycle accident in England. And we were at a loss. We'd already brought in postdocs. We'd already hired equipment. We were devastated because we were moving in that direction for sure. One of his young postdocs that was going to study under him came into my office when I came in the next day and said, could I be his postdoctoral supervisor? And I said, no. Not being unsympathetic to the situation, it was just that he was going to be a lab guy. I said, I'm a field guy. I've just made the discovery of this site. And if you want to learn how to be a field guide, why don't we go out there and see what this site has to offer? It bothers me. It's so close to where I'd been working for so long. And so out we went. August 15th. Job Kibbe, the postdoctoral student, my then 9-year-old son Matthew, my dog Tal, got back to the site, started walking up to it. I told him the story, you'll be thankful, shorter than I told you, of how I discovered the site, stood over it, and I said, okay, go find fossils. When you find them, call me over. I'll identify them, and let's see what this site has to offer. And with that, Matthew and Tal run off. This is in the center of a huge game reserve. There's leopards, and there's giraffe and zebra and stuff like that. And I thought he was going to go chase those, and I'd see him back at lunchtime. And he runs off, and I was looking at Job, and I said, you know, I think the miners left this alone because they probably found it like I did. They found it first, and then they moved up the hill, and they destroyed all those other caves. And as I said that, Matthew shouted out. He's now 50 feet off the site. He says, Dad, I found a fossil. He was off in the grass. The fossils were around me, not over there. And I almost didn't go look. But he's my 9-year-old son, and like any of you, you want to encourage fossil hunting. So I started walking over towards him. He was right at the base of this lightning-struck tree that's on the images here. He was holding a rock. 5 meters away from him, I knew that his and my life were going to change forever. Because sticking out of that rock he was holding, one of those classic pieces of concrete like breccia, was a clavicle, a hominid clavicle. I knew immediately what it was. It's this bone right here. And the reason I knew is because clavicles are very easy to identify. Very few animals have them in Africa. Bats and moles have them. This was too big, and primates have them. And of course, only amongst primates, hominids have sigmoid or S-shaped. And at that moment, I was probably one of the only world's experts on clavicles. I did them for my PhD. Matthew says I cursed. I don't believe that. I took the rock, I turned it over, and perhaps I might have cursed then, though I shall never admit it. Because on the backside of that was sticking out a mandible and other parts of the body of a hominid. It was clear. What Matthew had discovered was perhaps the rarest thing. As I said, about 80% of what we find are isolated teeth. At that time, there were probably 2,500 or 3,000 remains, individual remains of early hominids from all of Africa. Those little skulls and mandibles you see in things like National Geographic are extremely rare. Literally, there are just a few dozen. What are really rare are partial skeletons. People like me have a warped sense of what a partial skeleton is. That's the association of any piece of the cranium directly associated with any piece of the body of the same individual. And at that time, there were about 7 that had been discovered. You would know some of their names: Lucy, Turkana Boy, Littlefoot, the Dakika child, and you start running out of numbers and names as you get beyond that. And there I was probably holding one. Well, indeed, Matthew's discovery would start a great period of adventure for us. I would eventually call the site Malapa, and we would take that skeleton out. 3 weeks later, when I had the permits to actually work on the site from the South African government, we went back, and I found a proximal humerus and a scapula after looking at the site for several hours. There were 14 of us out there. We couldn't find anything, and then all of a sudden I saw one lying in the side of this little pit, and I realized that I'd found Matthew's skeleton. Because what's the odds? A clavicle. And no one had ever found 2 skeletons in the same place at the same time of these early hominids. That wasn't, though, the same skeleton. It turned out to be a second one, a female skeleton. The one on the right is the one Matthew found. It turned out to be a child that in developmental age is around 9 or 10 years of age. Coincidentally, the one on the left is the one I would find, a female skeleton. We would eventually find 4 additional skeletons at the site of Malapa without excavating. They were literally lying on the surface. It was an outrageous largesse, something I had never dreamed. As a paleoanthropologist, it felt like I had won the lottery. And I suppose with the kind of odds we did, I perhaps believed that as many people did. We would find other miraculous things as we would work through this site. We would find that the site of Malapa had organic preservation. You're going to be seeing published in scientific literature shortly the idea that we have found the first fossilized skin and hair associated with an early hominid at 2 million years of time depth. We've also found that the entire site was comprised of organic material. We published in Nature a couple of years ago the calculus and tartar that were on the teeth, and inside of that, food particulates. We had for the first time actually what an early hominid had put in its mouth and chewed. Just unbelievable. But that posed a problem too, because I couldn't just willy-nilly sort of go through this site. So we began publishing it. I put together an open collaboration, open access team. We brought together one of the largest teams in the world, almost 100 scientists, and we began publishing these papers. And within 18 months, we announced this new species, Australopithecus sediba. And then over the past 5 years, we published well over 35 scientific papers and finally got those covers of Science that we'd always been looking for and featured papers in Nature. In fact, 15 papers in Science over the time because of the large collaborative group. And so all my efforts were concentrated into that. I also had to do something special at the site. So I began the development of an extraordinary laboratory to protect the site, act as a scientific platform, so we could work with this potential organic material and what appeared to be lots and lots and lots of skeletons of all ages of this remarkable material. That occurred, I finally got funding for this structure back in early 2013. By May of 2013, we began construction on site, and I suddenly found myself with nothing to do. I'd met my research goals. We published everything completely over the time. Construction was going on at the site in a very delicate way, and I realized I'd made a huge error. The last time I'd been exploring, looking for something new, was that moment when Matthew said, "Dad, I found a fossil," because I'd won the lottery. Well, let me tell you a little lesson if you take nothing else away from this lecture today. There is a truism in the fact that it is incredibly rare to win the lottery. It is almost borderline impossible to win it twice. It is certain if you don't buy a lottery ticket. I brought together a group of people then. Through a coincidence, some of the young people that had worked for me previously were looking for work. Several of them were destitute. They'd gone looking for diamond mining up in West Africa with little success, as is true. Now, one of the interesting things about this area, which I didn't explain, is most of the fossil sites, like Malapa, are literally sitting on the surface. They're the remains of ancient caves. But when you look at that, you probably see a hilly terrain with classic African sort of image to it. I see a giant block of Swiss cheese, because underneath that terrain are literally kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of cave sites. Now, these are often not the kind of cave sites you might have in your mind, these giant systems. They're often these narrow passages. The light blue on this gives you some idea of the sort of network of small caves that are underneath this area. The blue lines up at the top, to give you some scale, there is about 1.5 kilometers of narrow squeezes. And so I enlisted these guys to actually get out in the field and begin finding and searching underground for fossil deposits, whereas I had spent those years looking across the surface. I'd tried an underground exploration back in the late 1990s, but with little effect. And the reason for that was we weren't really trying that hard. There was the idea that things underground would be young, because they're the living caves. And what we really wanted were the things that were eroded, the remains of ancient caves. Otherwise, you're just going to be looking at the abode of living animals. I had learned something from Malapa. Another thing from Malapa was, sometimes the best things to find are in your own backyard. So Pedro, Steve, and Rick, who you see pictured here, I sent out into the field, but I said, here's what you're going to do. You're going to start first in the places we think we know the best. You're going to go first into the Sterkfontein and Swartkrans Valley, because we've known those sites forever. They're the longest running excavations on the continent of Africa, Sterkfontein perhaps in the world. Now, if you notice, Steve and Rick, who were amateur cavers at that time, are physiologically appropriate for this exercise. You have to be, because these caves are not what you're envisioning, as I said earlier. They often require moving through these incredibly narrow areas, like the one you see Steve going into now. And so Steve and Rick and Pedro started working these areas. They did a very human thing. They started with all the dots that I had created back in the late 90s that they'd never been into. And they didn't find very much. they finally worked their way through in the Sterkfontein Valley to the last cave they wanted to go into, a cave called the Rising Star System. And the reason that they wanted that last is they knew that cave better than any other cave. It perhaps was the most explored cave on the continent of Africa. For the last 50 years, every amateur caver in South Africa has trained in that cave as part of their training because it's just right. It's close to the city, it's got just enough difficulty, so everyone's been there, completely mapped. But they went into this cave following my instructions to do them all. And one evening in late September, well, mid-September actually, around September 16th, they found a climb off to the side called Dragon's Back, labeled dramatically on the map, and there they found this slot that you see Steve going down into. They looked down into that, and let me give some scale. That is about 17.5 centimeters, which is about 7.5 inches wide. You can get a scale of his helmet there to realize he turns it down. He was about 35 meters underground as they looked down this little slot, and of course, being my cavers, they went down the slot. Both of them, not knowing what's at the bottom, not knowing whether it opens up. They followed that slot, that 7.5 inch slot, down for almost 60 feet underground and came out into a chamber. And there on the chamber, they started seeing small fragments of bone. There you can see them in white. As they moved down about 20 meters through this narrow passageway, they came out into a more open area, and there they found some bones lying on the surface. They thought those bones looked like the ones that I had trained them to look for. And so they realized they'd left their camera. Out they came, 2.5 hours, and they could only go in a little bit later. But in the meantime, they called me and I said, they thought they had made a find, and I said, look, guys, get me pictures and stuff because, I get called every week with, baby dolls buried in the backyard that people say are mummified hominids and things like that, and even from my own people. I wanted to see pictures. So back they went. I'd almost forgotten about it. On October the 1st, I was sitting at home, in a way working on the internet about 9 o'clock at night, and the doorbell on my gate went. I picked it up, and Pedro went, you're gonna want to let us in, almost in a creepy voice like that, and I almost didn't. But I did let him and Steve come in, and they came in with photographs. We put them in the computer and turned them on, and I was astounded. Because that may not look like much to you, but when I saw that, I realized that this is extraordinary. That is a primitive hominid mandible. I could tell by the tooth proportions. I could tell by the scale that they'd taken inappropriately left. If you notice, it says home sewing aid only. That they were big teeth, and that I could see from all the material around it that it looked like there was a skeleton there, just lying on the surface. I was blown away. I couldn't believe it. Never seen anything like that in South Africa. I'd never heard of anything like that in history. They told me about the site a little bit more. I was worried because it's effectively a very public cave. We celebrated a little bit. I sent them home. I couldn't sleep. 2 a.m., I picked up the phone and I called a friend. That friend was Terry Garcia, National Geographic Society, Vice President of Missions. And I said, Terry, near a computer, and I sent him pictures, and I said, listen, Terry, if you have ever had the chance to believe in me before, believe in me now. That's Explorer speak for I need money. He paused. You could probably hear him sigh. And he said, do what you need to do. That's grant agency for you can spend some of our money, but don't overdo it. So I then got cold feet because someone had given me the chance, and all I had really seen was a home sewing aid use only measure with some fossils. So I needed to get better photographs, better scaled photographs before I actually now invested what would be a very expensive operation. I knew I would never get down into this system. And so I did what any person would do. I trained my now skinny 6'4", 15-year-old son to take those photographs. And I sent Matthew down into that chamber along with Steve and Rick. After climbing through, I can get right to the edge and I can look down into this little slot. And there I sent my son down just under a week later. There I sat in the dark waiting 30 minutes, 40 minutes, thinking I'd killed my son. until I hear scrabbling coming up, and out pops Matthew's head out of this little slot. And he's looking at me, and because I'm going for Father of the Year, I looked at him and said, didn't say, "Are you all right?" I went, "And?" And he went, "Daddy, it's beautiful. It's so incredible. My hands were shaking for 3 minutes before I could take a picture." I looked at those pictures, and it was incredible. It was clear. There was a skull embedded in the dirt. There were limb bones there. It was outrageous. So that was a Saturday. I went home. Next Sunday, I made a decision to activate that expedition because I was worried that someone was going to get in there. I could see some of the material had been broken. It had fresh breaks. Someone had stepped on that material down there. And so I had to find people who could get down a 7.5-inch slot, 40 meters underground, excavate in a professional way this material. And so I did what anyone would do with that problem at hand. I put a Facebook ad out. I was looking for skinny people who could work well in groups in tight spaces underground with caving experience, climbing experience, can't be claustrophobic, have to be a team player, highly specialized work. Oh, and you have to have a master's or PhD in paleoanthropology or archaeology or a related field. I figured there were probably about 3 people in the world that had that. Within 10 days, I had almost 60 applicants, 80% young women. From that, I selected a most extraordinary team of young women from all over the world who were all physiologically and academically appropriate. That was by mid-October. On November 7th, I put a 60-person expedition into the field. They flew out not knowing what they were actually doing. I laid 3.5 kilometers of underground audio-visual cables so that I could be there and communicate through this excavation. We invented technologies that we would use to actually not only monitor the excavations, communicate with those signs, but actually map using 3D white light scanners underground. We created a science tent, a caver's tent, and a laboratory to process this skeleton that was going to come up. On November the 10th, down they went for the first time. It was dramatic stuff. We were seeing visions like this as they moved into this highly, highly dangerous area. We had safety cavers on board. We had medical doctors in place, everything in place you would need for a dangerous, dramatic excavation. And then the first material started to come up. All collected first line on the ground, just like you see it there. Being mapped in using white light lasers that have this hyper-accurate, real-time live mapping that we could watch and instruct as we were on the surface. On the second day, I knew I'd made a mistake. It was not a skeleton. It was many skeletons. Because what had come up by the second day was a second individual. We had 2 right femurs. Hominids and humans don't have that. Then we had 3, then 4. By the end of the week, working in shifts underground of 6 to 8 hours, where only 2 people could work at the front, the confines are so narrow there, we had discovered more early hominid fossils from this single chamber that had been discovered from the richest site in all of southern Africa that had been excavated for almost 80 years, Sturkfontein. More individual specimens in 1 week came up out of the ground. We had the time of our lives. We were clearly in the middle of something extraordinary. By week 2, we had to build larger science tents. The joke became we need a bigger safe. We began to see not just hundreds of fossils, but approaching 1,000 fossils. By the end of 21 days of this extraordinary experiment, we had quite literally uncovered in these shifts of remarkable people working now day and night in what was clearly an extraordinary environment, the richest early hominid assemblage ever discovered in history. We had, by the end of the 21 days, more hominid fossils than had been discovered in the previous 90 years in all of southern Africa, all from 1 little chamber. Now, I know some of you might think I am overemphasizing the danger of this. So Rick and Steve are going to give you a little tour of the route into this chamber as we work our way towards this particular chamber. This is not a particularly difficult squeeze. I can get through this, believe it or not. This one's only about 24 centimeters. So Rick is going to take us, this one we call, by the way, we call it post box because you get delivered through it. Very often, if you get stuck, you have to be pulled through this particular area. You journey along a route that has a number of these type of squeezes. Some of the areas, once you get through these smaller squeezes, are a lot easier to maneuver through. You can actually stand up, as you'll see Rick do in just a moment. He's going to walk you along the base towards Dragonback. So some of the areas are they got lots of space around you, like these sort of areas. This is at the base of Dragon's Back, where you have to begin a climb, but first you have to slide under some of these areas. Now, these caves are very dangerous for another reason we often don't think about, and that is because they're shallow caves, that they're only 30 or 40 meters underground, that the dirt and areas are quite loose above them, and you're always in danger of rock fall or one of these actual rocks becoming loose. So when you're doing a maneuver like this, and you have to take your helmet on, if the rocks above you shift at all, you can be in a small bit of discomfort. What they're going to do now is actually climb Dragon's Back and take you up to the top of that chute and then drop you down into the chamber itself. Dragon's Back is an extraordinary part of the climb. When we were doing the expedition, we would rope it off, but when we're not doing it, we don't rope it off. And if you fall at any one of these areas, you will fall between 6 and 12 meters to the ground, and you will probably die. You'll get a little bit of idea of the height as you stare down this part of the chute. As you can see, Steve's light down below as Rick squeezes through these. And some of the dangers are like this loose rock, which you're about to see. This loose rock actually fell on a National Geographic photographer and injured him quite badly recently. Oh, and Rick can dislocate his shoulders. I just want you to see that. Watch him do this. How about that for something? The reason I show you that is that these people really are quite heroic as they risk their lives to make these discoveries. The young men and women who are doing this work have become a new generation of explorers. Many of them are now permanently on our team, and we're now running permanent exploration entities into the field now. Right? My teams are actually in the field right now. We're also looking at new ways of handling this largesse. Never before had we had this many hominid fossils. We were a field of scraps. So what we brought together now, using social media but also contacts, is early career scientists combined with my pre-existing team that discovered sediba. So last May, we brought out 35 early career scientists who had never had the chance, nor probably ever would have the chance, to be involved in the original descriptions of early hominids, and we engaged them to produce papers. And those papers, I'm pleased to announce, are going to be seen very, very shortly. They will be appearing in Nature probably within the next 8 weeks. But I'm going to show you something the world hasn't really seen yet. Here's some of the beautiful glimpses of some of the fossils that we've discovered. The quality and preservation is extraordinary. 1,754 individual elements we've recovered. We recovered those from the open floor of the cave, and we did an excavation that consists of an excavation 1 meter by 40 centimeters. And that's what we recovered. The cave is full of thousands of remains. It is going to be an extraordinary, extraordinary experience. And they are, some of them, in remarkable condition. From this little cave, we are seeing something extraordinary happen. We are seeing a revolution in the quantity and quality of fossils that are appearing. We've left the cave now, locked it down, secured it, barred it up, and we put monitoring devices in it. But I'd also learned a lesson from Malapa. I'd quit exploring when I won the lottery at Malapa. I did not quit exploring after this. I actually built the teams and more aggressively put them out in the field, because now we had a new search picture. And I'll fill you in on a little secret. Malapa might have been a miracle. The rising star chamber proved it probably wasn't. And the more than 5 new early hominid sites we've discovered since then prove that it absolutely is not true. This stuff was right in front of us all the time. This particular site is 800 meters from the site of Swartkrans, a site dug continuously since 1947. It is less than a mile from the site of Sterkfontein, the longest running, most intensive dig in the history of paleoanthropology. And the fossils were lying effectively right on the surface, albeit a chamber deep underground that someone else had been in before we got there and hadn't recognized the material. The sites are littered across the region. We have not found just dozens of new fossil sites, but hundreds of them now. We now realize that we had blinded ourselves with the idea of bad luck. We had believed that it was lottery odds that were going to lead us to these discoveries, and so we talked ourselves into quit looking. Once you put teams back out in the field, you find out that the fossils are there. Here's a couple of lessons to end this on. One is avoid backyard syndrome. What is backyard syndrome? I use it like this. If I did an interesting experiment and asked you to look around this room and memorize it, and then we walked out and I handed you 2 sheets of paper and said, draw this room and draw your backyard, you'd draw this room better than you draw your own backyard. You draw your backyard as an amalgamation of how you see it without the detail, because that's the way our brains work. It keeps us from exploding. We look at new places where danger and things might be, and we memorize them, and then we discard that very quickly. It's how you can have a Post-it note on your fridge from 1998 and not realize it's there. We must avoid backyard syndrome because that's what this story is about. We scientists quit looking because we knew we'd already looked or others had. The second message of this is that we need to train the next generation and this generation and all of our generations that the age of exploration is not over with. I don't know how many of you felt like this, but certainly I talk to children all over the world, and there's this idea that the age of exploration was the age of sailing ships or the age of being first somewhere, the age of first person on an abandoned island, or the first person into a jungle, first person to climb a mountain. That the great discoveries had been made, and that what scientists would do is to stand incrementally on the shoulders of giants. I certainly thought that in paleoanthropology that would be my lot. But these discoveries challenge that. They challenge the idea that if you want to get into the pages of National Geographic or the cover of Science, that you'll have to do something like climb up the south side of Everest naked with a dead parrot on your shoulder. There are still things to be discovered. Yes, indeed, we as humans may have traversed pretty much every part of this world. But what these discoveries in the middle of the most explored area on planet Earth for these very objects say is that we haven't understood what we were walking over. Let me remind you that these fossils were so easy to find that a 9-year-old could do it. What does that mean for other sciences? In my field, what does it mean for places further from here? These conditions exist across big chunks of Africa, big chunks of Europe, Asia, the Americas. This is a new area, these subterranean environments. So if it's true in my field of science, it's got to be true in every field of science. We need to teach our generations that technology is not going to do this alone. You cannot just sit behind a computer and explore and discover. It can aid you, but you've got to use it as a tool. You've got to use this magnificent power that's been placed in front of us as a tool to make discoveries. You've got to use the ability to communicate with crowds across the world of experts to make discoveries. But eventually, you need to get up from behind the computer and get back out there and look. If I leave you with nothing else, is it become an explorer, a real one. Avoid backyard syndrome and make incredible new discoveries, because they're still out there to be made. Thank you very much, everyone.